Hello everyone, my name is Yude, and I'm excited to talk about Precise Museum's English patch for Puyo 20th anniversary on the PSP. I'll be talking about the translation side of things, and then I'll pass it over to Armando for the technical portion. So without any further ado, let's dive into it. Here's our little logo. As a quick aside, I'm an apprentice translator and a proofreader with Precise Museum. I also handle a few PR things, like posting on the social media and updating the website. Now, what is Precise Museum? We're a team consisting of 25 members of a variety of roles, like translators, proofreaders, programmers, video editors, and image editors. You can see the breakdown of our roles here on the slide. We have a lot of very talented people on our team who contribute to making our projects reality. So what do we do specifically? All of our projects are related to Puyo, which is a Japanese action puzzle game series published by Sega. So we translate things like comics, interviews, manuals, audio dramas, mobile game exclusive content, and novels. Our first projects when we started out mostly consisted of these things before we eventually pivoted to patching games as our team grew. So far, we've released 3 English patches: Puyo 20th Anniversary for the Nintendo DS, Puyo Chronicle for the 3DS, and our most recent release, Puyo or Puyo 4 for the Dreamcast. Currently, we're wrapping up our revamped translation for Puyo 20th Anniversary, which will be released for the Nintendo DS, the 3DS, and the PSP. Incidentally, this is the patch that we're discussing today. Now, what is this game? So many versions on so many consoles. Well, it might be better to just show you what it is. So what you just saw in the video was the core gameplay of Puyo. It's a competitive puzzle game where you have to arrange the pieces, or the Puyo, on the board to create chains. Not only is the gameplay addicting and really satisfying, it boasts a cast of more than 24 characters, all fully voice acted and drawn in a really adorable art style. Now, what makes this game so special? As you might have guessed from the title, which I've repeated multiple times, this game was released to celebrate the series' 20th anniversary. It's also a hallmark in the franchise for bringing back characters from the franchise's parent series, the dungeon crawler RPG Mado Monogatari developed by Compile. This game was not originally owned by Sega, and so there were a lot of characters in the older games that were brought back in 20th anniversary. Additionally, it has 20 playable game modes for both single player and multiplayer. This amount of modes was only recently beaten last year with the release of the Apple Arcade exclusive game Puyo Puzzle Pop. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why would you make 3 translation patches for the same game? And the answer is that we've always wanted this game to be accessible on multiple platforms. But when we started out, we lacked the programming savvy necessary to patch anything other than Nintendo DS, but we've since leveled up. With all that experience under our belt, we can offer a revamped translation for both the 3DS and the PSP versions of Puyo 20th Anniversary, which, unlike the Nintendo DS version, offer full voice acting for the story mode. I've broken down our translation process into 3 phases: the translation phase, the proofreading phase, and the playtesting phase. In the translation phase, we start by organizing the extracted text into files, which are then assigned to translators. Usually we just keep track of this process with spreadsheets, and we have a lot of spreadsheets, but this helps us to keep track of both the game's internal file structure and if there are any repeated files or files with similar dialogue. A translator then does their first translation, and one of our head translators, Ingu or Neni, revise it for any mistakes once it's complete. They also double-check each other's work. In the proofreading phase, we pass the revised scripts to proofreaders who read through it for a few weeks. We usually implement fixes that everyone is in agreement on here, like obvious errors or typos. Then we poll. This is where we take disputed suggestions or lines with multiple possible revisions and put them into Discord polls for our proofreaders to vote on. Finally, we move on to the playtesting phase. Basically, we just inject the text into the game to see how it works. Some lines might need to be changed to fit into text boxes, or the way dialogue is split up might just need to be altered to flow better as it shows up in a cutscene. While technically the playtesting process happens at or near a game's completion, it's an important part of translating to me since seeing dialogue in action can give us a new perspective for the flow in a scene. I've only briefly covered this phase here since Armando knows more about the technicalities of this than I do. As for revamping the translation of Puyo Puyo 20th Anniversary, it generally followed this same workflow. The entire script of our first release was translated by Ingu, who then took another pass at it to update the translation since we wanted to release a new version. Then, Neni revised it by comparing it against the original Japanese with audio to measure accuracy of the intent, the affect, the comedic timing, and so on. Discussion between them happened in Google Docs, and after resolving any differences in interpretations of the Japanese, the documents were passed to proofreaders for input on wording changes and to make the dialogue flow more naturally. The rest followed the process as described before. So the advantage of this process is being able to maximize consistency in character voice and style while minimizing errors. Additionally, there are always puns, jokes, and other weird character quirks to tackle in Puyo Puyo. We want to be able to balance that unique flavor with crafting an enjoyable experience for English players that parallels the Japanese one. And this ranges from putting ghost puns into the script to making a character who speaks entirely in katakana equally unreadable in English. And we also put in a lot of effort to ensure the quality of our translations, and this helps us to avoid something called the fan sub problem, aka releasing text that translators think sounds good in English versus what non-Japanese English speakers think sounds good in English. A good example is when two characters are having a conversation and one says the other's name. A novice translator or someone who's stuck in the Japanese grammar mindset might just translate this as their name, when in context it's being used similarly to you in English. For example, in this scene, Amity is talking to her friend Liddell, and we've translated it as, "You'll always be with me too. I mean, we're friends after all." But a novice translator might translate it as, "Liddell too. We'll always be friends." So, as you can see, a lot of effort went into revamping our translation, but now we get to talk about how all of this and the images were put into the game. And that's a wrap from me. I'll be passing the baton over to Armando now.
Thank you very much, Yude. Hello everyone, my name is Armando, and I was the one in charge of applying the translation to the PSP version of the game. So let's talk about what it took to get that done. But before that, I would like to thank Nick for his amazing contributions to the Puyo Puyo community. He made the majority of the tools that we used to make this patch possible. To simplify, this is a process to successfully patch a game. We need to access the game files such as graphics and text, we need to modify said files, and then we need to inject them back into the game. And finally, we need to test for any issues or mistakes that may have arisen. That is essentially the workflow. So let's start by dissecting the PSP version of the game. If we extract the ISO, we'll find a big file called game.dat. This file contains every asset used in the game, including images, text, sound, animations, and pretty much everything. Thankfully, Nick has made a tool that can extract and repack this file for us. Because of the way they're stored in this file, they'll lack any metadata such as name or file extension. So it was necessary that I checked what each individual file was and what it contained so I could label them for easy editing. Graphics were easy to find as they were stored inside regular zip files in the GIMP format, a standard for the PSP. And the files inside the zip archives did retain their names, which definitely helped. Text files were a little trickier to find as they lacked any extension. However, they were usually paired with an FNT file and two header files that contained some information about the contents of the text. Let's update some text. Once again, we will be using one of Nick's tools, Puyo Text Editor, to convert these files into readable JSON files that we can edit. However, before we can start editing the text, we need to set up a font with all of the characters that we need. If we open the font in a text editor, we will find the following. Two values that define the height and the width respectively of a grid, the amount of characters in the font, and then we have the character data. For each character we will have its white character representation, in this case it's this Japanese character right here, and here we have its width in pixels. After all of the character data, we find data for a GIMP file. This is a texture that contains the glyphs for each character, aligned with the grid defined at the beginning of the file. So now we need a font that contains all of the characters that we're going to be using, plus some punctuation characters. Let's try this in-game with some text. You'll notice that some of the characters in the text appear completely wrong. Turns out that for whatever reason, the game's math for variable width characters breaks after the first row of characters in the texture. If a character is not on the first row, it must have a width equal to the horizontal grid size. Otherwise, the logic for the font crops a completely different cell on the texture. Unfortunately, I lack the technical know-how to identify and modify this piece of code, so I had to work around it. This took a lot of iteration, but eventually I landed on a font that looks like this. I had to be very selective about which characters were allowed to be on the top row, to minimize the amount of characters with unnecessary spacing. Okay, let's try it in game, and seemingly at random, the text is sometimes very blurry. This only happens in spots where the text is automatically centered based on the longest line, such as during the game's cutscenes. Let's zoom in to better see what's happening. The game tries to center the entire block of text based around the longest line, but when the total width of the longest line is an odd number, the center line lands in the middle of a pixel, so the text gets misaligned with the pixel grid of the screen. To fix this, before converting the text, a Python script checks if the width of the longest line is odd and then adds an extra invisible character that adds +1 to the total width, and now the text is no longer blurry. Now that we have a way to edit text and graphics, a way to automate the process was necessary. A Python script was built that scans a patch folder for any image and text files, and if it finds it on a JSON named last modified, it will compare its modification date. If it does not match, the file is marked as modified, and then it is converted, and if applicable, it is packed into its respective archive. Then we rebuild game.dat. We update the ISO, and we do a first pass of testing to see if there's any mistakes or crashes that we can catch. And with that, we have everything we need to apply the translation to the game. However, while waiting for the translators and proofreaders to finalize the text, I started experimenting with the animation files of the game, which are used extensively in the game not only for character animation, but also to define menu layouts. They are the SNC files you'll find inside most zip files in the PSP version of the game. They're similar to Flash in a way, where you have sprite objects, layers, and animations. It's a somewhat simplified version of the layout format used in Sonic games during the early 2000s, such as Shadow the Hedgehog on the PS2 and GameCube. Combined with the graphics inside the SNT archives, we get this result in game. Opening one of these files in a hex editor, we'll find a bunch of patterns. Without going into too much detail, this is essentially how I reverse engineered the format. I essentially just poked at the numbers and saw what happened. By modifying these files, loading up the modified file in-game and observing its effects, we can get a good idea of how the file is set up, what it stores, and how we can manipulate it. As you can see, it stores a list of textures and their sizes, though it is not used in the game, so I usually ignore it. Then a list of cropping points indicating the texture indices and their coordinates. Then we have banks that contain elements that can hold a sprite and various transformation values such as position, scale, rotation, etc. And finally, we have animations, where each animation defines different motion tracks and keyframes for each element in the file. Knowing this, I created a Python script to convert these SNC files into JSON files that I could edit somewhat easily. Then, using the Godot engine, I built an animation editor that allowed me to intuitively edit these files. This essentially gave me almost full control over all of the UI and menu layouts, as well as character animations in the game. I say almost because some of the files were hard-coded to contain some specific data in a specific way, such as, for example, element names being in a specific order different from their indices. I use this to modify the layouts, such as, for example, here in the school menu, where I moved the icons that were covering some of the text to the side. And that would have been it, but the ability to edit these files also sparked an interesting idea. You see, the 3DS version of this game did something very interesting. Since it came out later than the other versions, they had improved most of the character animations, adding extra moving parts or adjusting timings, and in general they looked a lot nicer. Since all of the versions of the game use the same format with super minor differences that can be adjusted for, such as for example, fixed points being used on the 3DS version rather than floating points, I decided to port these animations to the PSP version of the game as an optional separate patch from the translation itself. To convert these files, I wrote a simple Python script that adjusted every element size and their positions to better match the PSP resolution, and then I created new spreadsheets for each animation file to account for the extra moving parts. And this is the result in game. As you can see, the differences can be pretty striking, such as with Feli's animation here. Now, when will the English patches be available to download? Well, you will be able to download them right now on our website at precisemuseum.com. And with that, we have reached the end of our presentation. I hope it helped shed some light about what really goes into making a translation patch and the amount of attention and care that was put into this project, especially the translation and proofreading parts. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll check out Puyo 20th Anniversary on the PSP. And also, thank you very much to the PSP Homebrew Discord for allowing the opportunity to showcase our work.